Tonight on Free Minds TV, we'll be talking about Ron Paul and the polls, crime in Australian churches. We'll tell you who was arrested for drunk driving in New Hampshire. All that plus a whole lot more coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
And welcome to episode 155 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you, as always, is Toby.
And Nick.
And Nick, where's our set? It's not here.
Well,
we promised the viewers.
It's probably starting to annoy the viewers at this point.
We promised it for a year now.
It is very, very
two
nearly
episodes
ready.
We said episode 155.
I swear to God, but it just wasn't ready to go up. There were some finishing touches that needed to happen, and I just didn't have time to finish them.
Do I have to break out my phone number graphics?
Here's the promise I'm making to the viewers, as opposed to the phone number idea.
I like
if
the
it
phone
is
number
not
idea.
up, if we are not sitting at a new set by the next episode, I will have to do a shot of hot sauce, one shot glass, on air. And I'm not looking forward to that because I don't like spicy things. So it will be done. That is my promise. Either that, but then again, there's probably people out there rooting for me to not finish it so they can see me do that on air and
I'm
throw
going
up everywhere.
to provide the hot sauce and the shot glass so you don't get one of those little dainty ones and some kind of wussy hot sauce as well.
I know. Well, yes, that's acceptable.
All right, because I've got some big shot glasses. Yes. All right. Moving right along, we do have a show to get into, even though we don't have a set. The content's not going to change. And you know what? A lot of the viewers are actually listeners, listening to the audio podcast of the show, which we also put online as well. So they have no idea what we're talking about. But anyway.
We're talking about a TV set.
A TV set. Yeah, right. But I mean, it doesn't really make a difference to them.
Not really.
They'd probably be the ones rooting for you to drink the hot sauce, to hear you scream. Anyways, moving right along, we have a show to get into. We are going to be getting into some crime statistics in Australia. Which would you think is more prevalent for crime, a church or, say, a strip club? We'll be getting into that story. But first, we're going to be talking about Barack Obama and Ron Paul. Now, is it Obama's popularity shrinking or Ron Paul's is growing?
It could be a little bit of both. I doubt you would have seen this in this poll result initially right after Obama took office. And this is, as disclosure, coming from Rasmussen. And as a polling organization, it's generally believed that Rasmussen tends to lean to the right or towards Republicans as opposed to towards Democrats if they have a bias, which they probably do have some bias, but probably only to a certain degree. But pretty consistently, they tend to rate Republicans higher than Democrats as opposed to the other polling organizations. However, even if you consider, say, a 3 or a 5 point bias, this is still pretty interesting. In a recent Rasmussen poll, Ron Paul, if he was theoretically running as the Republican nominee against Barack Obama in 2012 for the U.S. Office of President, he would be losing by only 1%. Ron Paul would be at 41%. Barack Obama would be at 42%. Now, there were 11% who said they'd prefer a different candidate, while 6% were undecided.
Now, that's what I was going to ask you about, Nick, is if it was a full, I mean, did they have a third option there? So were you just getting right versus left going on here? Or there was another option where you could say prefer a different candidate and only 11% picked it?
Right.
Wow, that's pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, I mean, the way I look at it, I did want to point out too, within the Republican Party, Ron Paul, he spoke at the Southern Republican Leadership Conference, which is sort of, they had a straw poll there. Obviously,
he takes
this is
straw
early
poll.
polling. Well, he didn't take it. Mitt Romney took it by 1 vote. There were quite a few votes cast. Ron Paul was a very close second, 1 vote behind Romney, who is #1. So, but still, I mean, he's doing well. He's doing very well. If the analysis of the poll, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but in other analyses I was reading, among independents, Ron Paul was far and away doing a lot better.
Before we go on, Nick, I do have to stop us because there are some people who are tuning in for the first time and they don't exactly know what we're talking about here with why is Ron Paul? Are we just a bunch of Republicans? And no, Ron Paul isn't really a Republican. I mean, if you were to ask or look at what he stands for and his principles, he's more of a libertarian candidate than anything else. In fact, he did run under the libertarian ticket some 20 years ago or so, and he still has most libertarian principles. So, I mean, he's not your typical Republican candidate at all. I mean, he does go under that name because, well, no third party is ever going to get elected to anything on the federal level. I think I can say that with a pretty good sound confidence. But I just wanted to point that out for people who are tuning in for the first time who don't think that we're just right versus left like everybody else is.
Yeah, I mean, you have to point out that Ron Paul is anti-war. That's not a terribly popular position to take inside, the political core of the Republican Party. Well, of the Republican Party.
Right now, it
with with some Republicans.
I mean, because Barack Obama is now in charge of the war, so now we gotta hate him, right?
Right, and I mean, I think part of the reason that Ron Paul's popularity seems to have increased, number one, is that he ran for the Republican nomination back in 2008. He didn't get a whole lot of votes. I think if you add it all up, he was somewhere around 10% of the votes in the Republican primaries. But he did get to talk about his ideas quite a bit, and he was predicting a financial crisis before it actually occurred. So a lot of people, I think, are giving him some credit for pointing out that government intervention in the markets was going to cause a crisis, not only a crisis in the economy, but to some extent, which I think we'll see it materialize more over the next few years. It hasn't happened so much yet, but a crisis with the currency. And I think that's where we're headed. You can see us on that track right now with the way the national debt is just exploding. And the nation is really on a path to insolvency. And this is something that is being talked about now. People are actually talking about the fact in the mainstream more and more than I remember 4 or 5 years ago
when Ron
that
Paul
we're
was
bankrupt.
bringing it. Yeah, when Ron Paul was bringing it to light, it was fringe. He's a kook, and then a couple of years later, it's actually happening.
The U.S. is pretty bankrupt. Yeah.
Nick, what I really love about Ron Paul, one of the main things is we both have talked about this on this show, and most of the American public, I think, at this point, gets the fact that if we continue down the same stuff over and over again, it's going to lead to a train wreck eventually. I think most people have figured that out. The same stuff on the same track eventually will not work.
All the big government spending.
Eventually, it has to stop. Ron Paul's a candidate who actually is proposing huge changes. Most right-left candidates, they're change here, change there, but we're still going down the same track.
Very
Ron
little
Paul,
change to the
drastic
status quo.
change. End the war on drugs. Bring the troops home, not only from Iraq and Afghanistan, but all 130 countries that we're in. Actually, have a military that's constitutional. I mean, he's proposing going back to gold standard, complete currency reform. I mean, there's so many drastic changes, and not just one, but across the board, principal changes getting us back to the Constitution that really are the only way the federal government's going to stay afloat.
Well, that's the thing I wanted to point out, is that while they're radical changes from the status quo that we have today, if you actually look at most of the country's history, some of the things that I think helped make the United States relative to the rest of the world, very free, very prosperous, very successful, is that there was a gold standard, that we had a non-interventionist foreign policy for the most part, up until mostly the last century. There were some adventures in Mexico and things like that. It wasn't all roses, but overall, there was much more non-interventionist bent in foreign policy. The U.S. minded its own affairs. It did not have a huge standing army. It did not have what I think could rightly be called an empire around the world. And it did not have a central bank. It didn't have the Federal Reserve out there debasing the currency and manipulating markets. So if you want to try to get back to having a society that's you're going to be able to be free and prosperous, well, I think those are some of the core issues you need to address, as well as personal liberty issues like the war on drugs. But at the core of it all, I think the Federal Reserve is a big issue, and foreign policy is a big issue. And this is one area where Ron Paul definitely, the difference in his libertarian beliefs stands out against today's traditional Republican beliefs, because most Republicans are pro-war.
Right. I mean, Ron Paul voted against the Patriot Act. Not a lot of other people did that. Right. Anyways,
not even civil liberties loving Democrats.
I know, and so you're talking about, so Ron Paul is not your Republican, and if you want more information, we've got tons of archives on him, and just Google his name, something like that, Ron Paul. Anyways, I'm sure we'll be talking about him more in the future. Who knows? Will he make a 2012 bid? I don't know.
It'd be interesting.
If he doesn't, there's no point in really voting on the federal level, but it's always fun to talk about. All right, moving along, Nick, it's time to go over to the land down under in Australia to talk about a little story that I just find interesting. It challenges a lot of people's already held beliefs on where seedy behavior takes place, where crime often takes place. This coming from the NSW, Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research.
I think that's New South Wales.
New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research has showed that there are more crimes being committed at churches and sanctuaries than at adult businesses, which include sex clubs, strip clubs, brothels, massage parlors, homosexual clubs, gaming houses, and gambling clubs. Yes, overwhelmingly, the place where you were more likely to get robbed, assaulted, as well as use illegal substances were churches and other places of worship. Let's see, 1,600 people were charged with committing a range of 27 offenses in the state's places of worship in 2008 versus only 282 people in adult premises. Now, that's pretty interesting, Nick.
Now, here's the thing. I think that there's some bias in the way that this is being done, because I don't think people in, say, a strip club or a bar are as likely to report somebody for, say, using drugs or disturbing the peace. They might just kick them out of the establishment. But just because there are fewer arrests taking place at those establishments doesn't necessarily mean there's less crime taking place.
This could.
If fewer people are calling the police, which I would think they're less likely to do than if you were at church.
It could be.
I don't know. That would be my guess.
You know what? This is just the report, and that's pretty much all it says. I mean, it does break things down. Places of worship were ahead in sexual offenses.
Well,
I guess there's some pent-up rage there, Nick, as well as... Anyways, it goes on. I'll post it up on our show content if you want to break it down. But I just find it a little bit interesting, Nick. If nothing else, places of worship cost much more in tax dollar resources for the police coming and such than these adult businesses, including, we're talking about sex shops and strip clubs and massage parlors and brothels even. I mean, talking about more crime being done in a place of worship in huge amounts, 1,600 versus 288 or 282. It's a big difference, and you're right. Probably some of it's not being
reporting
differences. But
I mean,
if nothing else,
when you see statistics like this, you always have to consider the fact that statistics can show what you want them to show, and even if there was no manipulation here, even if this is just the raw data, this is really the statistics that are coming in. That doesn't mean that that correlates to what actually takes place in the real world. You do have to.
But I have heard the argument, Nick. I've heard the argument that if we allow this sex shop or this gambling house to come in, crime's going to go through the roof and we're going to have to hire more police officers.
Yeah, and
when in fact, we might have to hire more police officers if we allowed a church to open up downtown. Just saying. Right. We're talking tax dollar for dollar, sex shop much less costly to the taxpayer than, say, a church. Not to mention that a sex shop pays taxes and a church doesn't.
Anyway, at least in the U.S.
At least in the U.S. I don't know how it works down under. Anyways, just some more food for thought for challenging people to think outside the box rather than just looking things in black and white. And as you said, Nick, who knows what these numbers actually mean? Just something to, some gum for the brain to chew on, think about. Anyways, when we come back, we are going to be getting into some more statistics, some more confusing statistics to ramble on about, and which New Hampshire man was caught driving under the influence. We'll tell you. It's worth mentioning. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. This is Free Minds TV.
This is Sam I Am from the Obscured Truth Network, and you're watching Free Minds TV.
And welcome back to Free Minds TV. It is Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And if you like the show, consider helping us out. freemindstv.com or freemindsmedia.org or any combination of those. Google us. You'll find us online. We have all the archives of the show, the radio show, the members area, only $3 a month, and other ways to contribute and help us out, all up at freemindsmedia.org. I mean, it really, we don't get paid to do the show. We do it because we find it important to get this message out there, and we've gotten a lot of emails back saying that people appreciate it back. That's why we're still on the air. That's the only reason.
And we're on more stations than ever. Thanks to people's support, because that does cost money. At least some of the stations that cost us money.
Yeah, in the past couple of months, we've spent several $100s staying up on
16 now?
We're somewhere, it ranges. Some stations pick us up every other week, so we're between 16 and 20-something stations every week, and plus the internet, the podcast, and other things. So, I mean, we are getting out there, and it's costing us more and more money because the system that we're using, pegmedia.org, is the system that really branches out a lot of these cablecast shows out to other cable stations. They used to cover all the costs, but recently they started charging either the person who downloads them or the producers could opt to pay the fee. We opted to pay the fee, and it's cost us a few $100s so far, and we want to keep being able to do that. The only way
gets us on more stations because stations like free shows.
Right, exactly. And the stations we're on are going to continue to download our show. So if you want to help us do that, help spread out the message, help it keep going, consider a donation. Anyways, we do need to move on, Nick. We've got a lot to talk about. We do base this show out of New Hampshire, so let's get into a New Hampshire story. But this really is probably happening all over the United States and in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and this is an interesting story. New Hampshire State Liquor Commissioner charged with DWI. One of New Hampshire State Liquor, and it's important to point out there's not just one liquor commissioner, it's a commission, so there's a bunch of people on there. One of New Hampshire State Liquor Commissioners has been charged with driving while intoxicated. Police chief of the town of Guilford says Richard Simard was stopped around 11:30 Saturday night after Laconia police alerted them to a possibly intoxicated driver. Guilford Chief John Markland says his officers did a field sobriety test. Simard refused to submit to a breath test. Now, my understanding is that typically if you fail the field sobriety test, then you pretty much have to take the breathalyzer, or if you don't take it, it's gonna be assumed that you are above the legal limit.
That's what they taught me in driver's ed, Nick.
Right. So he didn't actually test positive for alcohol, but he failed I would assume he failed the field sobriety and he refused to take the breathalyzer. So Simard was released on $1,000 personal recognizance bond and is due in court May 6th. Markland described it as a routine DWI stop, but says his officers knew about Simard's position. Governor John Lynch's office, as of the time we're talking about this, is expected to issue a statement, but we don't have anything.
We care what the Governor Lynch has to say.
I think it's funny when they issue statements. I'm sure it'll be something like, it is not acceptable, blah, 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 blah. But I just think this story is important. It's important to point out that
it highlights so many things here,
Nick. The people who are deciding for us, our betters, who make up the rules and that bars have to follow, that the rest of us have to follow, they don't always do such a good job of following the rules themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting, Nick. I heard we're talking about numbers, statistics here. Mothers Against Drunk Driving put out the number that I think it was your average drunk driver drives drunk 900 times before they're busted and given a DWI. So, I mean, you can assume that this is not an isolated incident. That's only happened one time with this gentleman. And, I mean, if you're going to zoom out to the greater picture, the only reason we're talking about this is because it's so hypocritical and it's this official guy who's enforcing alcohol laws on other people, not trying to say driving drunk is okay here. I think it's very dangerous and it can kill many people.
That's one of the liquor laws I would tend to agree with. But
you're putting others at risk. I mean, a lot of the time we talk about laws on this show and people will say, well, if we went with your version of government, it would be anarchy. Well, no, we want a smaller version of government that just says you can't infringe on anyone else's freedoms and liberties. So if you're harming someone else or putting someone else in danger, well, you can't do that. And I think this would fall under one of them, depending on the limits and stuff. But the reason I think it's so important to talk about is because this happens more than once, Nick. It happens more often than I think
a lot of times
most people would want to know.
It never makes it to the news.
Well, most of the time you don't get caught. 900 out of...
Well, and if you're politically connected, if you're somebody who is, a state representative or you're on a commission or a board, if you're politically connected, there's a very good chance you're not going to be arrested. So there's nothing to report on because, well, there was no event, really. There's no way anyone else would know about it. There's no public record to say that the police ever hassled you and then let you go because of who you were. So this does happen. I mean, you'd have to be naive to think it did not happen. And I think it happens a lot more frequently than most people would tend to believe.
Yeah, unfortunately. But, I mean, nobody's perfect. And the same people who enforce the laws, those officers with that badge, well, they make mistakes too, Nick. They're human. There's people who write the laws and deem that we have to act in a certain way. Well, they make these same
That's the
mistakes as
interesting
well.
thing, is that people who make the case that we need a lot of laws and a big government around because people are so awful. Well, it seems like they're overlooking the fact that
They're
the
awful
government
too.
is filled with people. They're not robots on these commissions or in the legislature. They're people. So if people are evil, then you're giving people power over other people, and this is supposed to make them good when everyone else is evil.
Yeah,
Doesn't make a lot of
compound that
sense.
on the how power corrupts things, and you just have evil people being attracted to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you know you're likely to be able to get away with things, I think you're more likely to do them. At least most people are. Not everyone is necessarily going to act on that, but that's a tendency that people have.
It's a human trait. Anyways, we do need to move on, Nick. We've got to get into some numbers about how green people are and how much they're saving the planet, or at least think they're saving the planet.
Yeah, well, this is actually an interesting story here. I guess it's based on Gallup polling, and it's talking about how green or environmentally friendly Americans are today in 2010 compared to how environmentally friendly they were back in the year 2000. And it doesn't, basically the conclusion of the article here is that Americans really aren't very much more environmentally friendly at all. In 2000, 90% of Americans said that they voluntarily recycled newspapers, glass, aluminum, and other things. Well, in the year 2010, 90% of Americans say that they recycle those things. So 0% change. It's been a decade. There are not more people recycling.
Well,
Or at least not
90%, that's
voluntarily.
most of them, Nick. That's
most of
pretty
them.
good. That's pretty good.
But it's not more green.
It's true, it's not more green, but I mean, at least we're keeping the status quo high.
Well,
I guess
kind of.
if recycling actually does help, but I should point out before we move on that some studies have shown that recycling certain products is actually worse for the environment than throwing them in a landfill where they can rot on their own. But such as paper, the bleaching process that some of these papers go through can oftentimes be more harmful to the environment than growing a new tree and cutting it down. Anyways, let's move on though.
Well, there was a slight increase in people who reduced their household use of energy, 83% in 2000, up to 85% in the year 2010. That's a 2% increase. I would point out with this one, I'm a little confused because if these same people are reducing their household use of energy year after year, then that's a compounding thing. So even if it's 80% year after year, if those 80% of people are reducing every year, that's still an improvement.
Right,
Not
you
sure
know
what that shows.
Well, a lot of those numbers could also be due to a lot of products that are coming out are more energy efficient. So every time you buy, say, a new refrigerator or a new TV or something, chances are it's more energy efficient than the one you just threw out.
Yep.
So is that people purposely doing that, or is that just what's happening? I don't know.
I have no idea. Now, fewer people contributed money to environmental conservation or wildlife preservation groups. 40% of people said they had back in the year 2000. Only 36% in the year 2010.
Well,
So,
the economy's in the dumps right now, Nick. You got to give
I'm not
people a
saying
break.
why these numbers are what they are. I'm just saying what the Gallup numbers are here, Toby.
I haven't contributed a penny to the forest.
Just to any group, any environmental group, anything like
Oh,
that.
people have been voting with donated with their votes, Nick. They voted for Barack Obama. Who's
Actually,
gonna end global
nobody
warming.
more is doing. Voted for, worked for candidate because of their position on environmental issues. In the year 2000, 28% of people said they had done that.
There wasn't a vote in
In the year 2010, well, actually the numbers did go up. Well, they did 2003, 2007, but it's the same. In the year 2010, it's exactly the same, 28%. So people aren't more political about the environment either.
I don't know then.
Fewer people actually contacted elected officials. 18% said they had in the year 2000. Only 17% said they had in the year 2010. I just wanted to point out that for all the propaganda, the hype about the environmental movement, the green movement, it doesn't really seem like anybody cares, except for the people in the environmental movement. I'm not saying you should be bad to the earth. I think it's good. I think sensible conservation, and there are sensible things that you can do, but a lot of the environmentalists are talking about things that a lot of times are either very short-sighted and the cost of them don't really justify actually implementing them, like solar power, things like that, or they're talking about things that are actually destructive to the environment.
Like solar power in some
Or ethanol
in some circumstances, Nick. I've got to tell this story. I didn't print out the article, unfortunately, but I've just got to recap it real quick. I mean, solar panels good if it works, but it's not always very efficient. Yet governments around the world like to hand out big bucks for anyone who's willing to produce solar power in subsidies. So there was this one article, and I don't know where it was. I'll try to post it up on the forum for a show notes if you want to take a look at it. But it explained about one company who bought a couple of big old diesel generators, and with those they produced electricity, which they used to shine some big old lights on a whole bunch of solar panels that they had, and then feed that energy back into the grid and get buco bucks from the government subsidies for that. The only reason they were busted, well, they were collecting a little bit too much solar power during the evening hours when the sun was not shining. So, I mean, there's all sorts of stories, and that's not an isolated incident either. The article talked about a few different times that had happened, but where, well, we're not really as green as we think we are with certain products. I mean, there's this whole green fad right now where if you buy certain products, you're helping the environment. Well, no, you're actually never helping the environment when you buy a product. The only way to help the environment is to leave the product on the store shelf and go without it. I mean, there's no green product out there. There's greener products, but
Right,
there's
less harmful
There's
products.
less harmful, but every single product that you pay money for is harmful. So don't go pretending that you're all high and mighty and if you're buying green products, because even if they are what they tout they are, and most of them aren't, it's kind of like organic now. Everyone puts it on because they think people want it. This poll's showing otherwise, but everyone's putting it on because they think that's what people want. A lot of them aren't necessarily green, and even if they were, it doesn't mean it's good for the environment. Chances are it's very bad for the environment. All products are bad for the environment, Nick.
Yeah, some are better in some ways and some are worse in other ways, but it's important to point out
Besides trees.
A lot of the alternatives that you
buy
hear
a
about,
tree.
or the ways to reduce your impact on the environment, there are drawbacks to them too. That doesn't mean they're not worth doing, but things like CFLs, compact fluorescent lights. A lot
full of
people
mercury.
They use a lot less
I've been throwing them in the
electricity.
rivers, Nick, and the fish have been eating them and killing everyone.
They use a lot less electricity, but they do contain a lot of mercury. So, yeah,
So I
that's
should
just
stop
something-
throwing my mercury light
You
bulbs
should
in the
not
river?
throw those into the river.
But this package says I have to drive 50 miles to a proper recycling center. 50 miles, Nick. You know how much gas I'm going to burn up in those 50 miles
true.
every time I want to throw out a light bulb? Maybe I should collect them and don't just take one trip.
That would be more efficient, more green of you. I mean, the same thing with cars. I mean,
Right.
these hybrid vehicles, they do use a lot less gasoline.
But the batteries they put them in, Nick, are very
Right.
bad for the environment.
And the fleet of hybrids that was hitting the roads a few years ago, well, 10 years from now, they're going to be pretty much beat up. Those Priuses and everything, they're going to be done. Yeah. And then you're going to have tons and tons of batteries, which are pretty nasty. I'm not saying they can't be recycled. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy a hybrid. But it's important to point out that just because something, say, uses less gasoline, that doesn't mean there are not other things to consider. You can't be short-sighted.
That much better either, Nick. I mean, some of these hybrids, they only get like 45 miles to the
They're
gallon.
not that much better than something like a Mini Cooper.
Yeah, I got this little mini Honda Civic I drive around. It's like 1997 Honda Civic.
It is a small car.
42 miles to the gallon, Nick. Why? Because it's little. I weigh more than the car, I think. It just has to carry me around. It's got no bulky weight to it. You want to buy an environmentally friendly car, make it small. Or you can buy a Prius and feel proud. Yes, proud. And with that battery, dump it in the landfill. Anyways.
Or in the river.
Different thoughts? We'd love to hear them. fmtv@freemindsmedia.org is the web address. freemindsmedia.org is the regular address where you log on, type in your thoughts to us, contact link via the contact link, or check out the archives, donate, help us money, all that, freemindsmedia.org. All right, until next week, where we'll either have a set or a Nick unable to do this show because his mouth is burning. It's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have a good one.